I was the best at what I did. They were the best at what they did. And it was a meeting of the minds that was perfect for me, and John felt for them.
Phil Spector there in his final filmed interview. Let It Be may not have been the meeting of minds he described, but thanks to his efforts, this troubled album finally got to see the light of day over 1 year after the original tapes were recorded and 2 versions from Glyn Johns rejected. As John recalled in his interview in 1970 with Rolling Stone,
nobody could face looking at it. So when Spector came around, we was like, well, all right, if you want to work with us, go and do your audition, man. Do. And he worked like a pig on it. I mean, he'd always wanted to work with the Beatles, and he was given the shittiest load of, badly recorded shit and with a lousy feeling to it ever. And he made something out of it. It wasn't fantastic, but it was, when I heard it, I didn't puke. I thought, oh.
Spector did not spend long reviewing the hours of takes which had gathered dust since January 1969. In fact, he couldn't do as he was working on a tight deadline necessitated to support the movie release. In all, he spent just 10 days selecting takes, editing, mixing, overdubbing and arranging one session. In January 1970, Spector had worked with both John and George on Instant Karma. This time round, Spector would not produce any sessions with the Beatles present, with the exception of Ringo, who provided a backing drum beat to accompany the one-day orchestral sessions. Spector started work at Abbey Road Studios Room 4 on the 23rd of March 1970. Coincidentally, Paul, booked in under the pseudonym of Billy Martin, was over in Studio 3 at the same time working on McCartney. The next time the two would be in the same room together would be at the Q Awards in London in 1997. When Spector got up to make his acceptance speech, Paul walked out. George Harrison attended most of Spector's mix sessions together with Alan Klein and balance engineer Peter Brown. The first day produced final mixes of 3 of the songs from the rooftop performance, 2 different versions of I've Got a Feeling, One After 909 and Dig a Pony. Spector also commenced work on an extended mix of I'm in Mine and Across the Universe, getting them ready for the orchestral overdubs he was planning to add later. The original recording of Across the Universe was taken from the 1968 session, with Spector slowing the speed, changing the key and removing the backwards guitar and tambura. Spector returned 2 days later to work on Two of Us, For You Blue and Teddy Boy, an interesting choice since Glyn Johns had been told to remove this song from his own version of the album because it wasn't going to be in the movie. When it became clear that Paul was including Teddy Boy on his upcoming solo LP, the song was quietly dropped. On March 26th, The Long and Winding Road was prepped for the orchestra, and Let It Be was reworked to create a version that was slightly different from the George Martin produced single that came out a few weeks earlier. The Spector version became longer, using only George's guitar solo from a 1970 session. Ringo's hi-hat was given greater prominence by the addition of echo. Balance engineer Peter Brown commented that Spector wanted tape echo on everything, seemed to take a different pill every half an hour, and had his bodyguard with him. The bodyguard used to come along and sit outside the door. Spector then took the George Martin produced version of Get Back, adding some chatter at the start and crossfading the applause in John's speech at the end. The next day involved inserting 2 pieces of speech from John from the movie, Hark the Angels Come and I Dig a Pygmy, and preparing the final mixes of Dig It and For You Blue. April Fool's Day may be the most controversial session for the Beatles and their fans. Spector moved from Room 4 into the cavern of Studio 1, where a 33-piece orchestra and 14 vocalists overdubbed parts onto the long and winding road across the universe and I Me Mine. Engineer Brian Gibson told Mark Lewison that Spector worked differently from anybody else he'd ever worked with. He reportedly wanted all the effects added as they were being recorded, instead of afterward. He records Spector losing his temper with the studio's less than state-of-the-art equipment until Ringo, the only Beatle present at this session, took him quietly aside and said, "Look, they can't do that. They're doing the best they can. Just cool it." Peter Brown recalled that the musicians were contracted to play only 2 songs, but were given scores for 3 without the promise of extra payment. "I warned Phil that he'd never get away with it," Brown said. And of course, the orchestra got up and walked out. The stoppage lasted beyond midnight. Brown even went home until Spector finally relented. A demo of The Long and Winding Road was originally recorded during the White Album sessions but left unfinished. The subsequent recording at Savile Row, as available on Anthology 3, was little more than a run-through, with several errors evident on John's bass parts. In order to free up space for the orchestral overdubs, Spector had to remove one of Paul's vocal tracks. Arranger Richard Hewson, who had previously worked with Paul, was commissioned to write a string arrangement and conduct the orchestra without Paul's knowledge.
Went and met Phil Spector, and we talked about doing the orchestra. I said, "Yeah, well, okay, I could put some, a few violins and trumpets on it and whatnot, working away." And then phoned me, "Hey, Richard, I want 20 violins. I don't want 6 violins. I don't want that. I want 20. I want a harp." But I'm on the Beatles record. I want a big choir. Beatles record, oh my God. And so I did this arrangement for The Long and Winding Road, which sounded good, actually. I mean, I have to say, it was a big score, but it worked. We were working just with Paul's voice on the piano, overdubbing to that. He didn't know anything about it, of course, at all.
In an interview with Ray Connolly for the London Evening Standard, Paul commented, "A few weeks ago, I was sent a remixed version of The Long and Winding Road with harps, horns, an orchestra, and a woman's choir added. No one had asked me what I thought. I couldn't believe it. I would never have female voices on a Beatles record." The record came with a note from Alan Klein saying he thought the changes were necessary. I don't blame Phil Spector for doing it, but it just goes to show that it's no good me sitting here and thinking I'm in control, because obviously I'm not. Anyway, I sent Klein a letter asking for some of the things to be altered, but I haven't received an answer yet. Paul's statement was not entirely true. I Am the Walrus featured the prominent voices of no less than 8 female performers from the Mike Sam's Singers. Spector himself would go on to point out that Paul was happy to accept an Academy Award for the song and performed it in his solo shows with practically an identical arrangement, something he still does to this day. Paul would also continue to work with Richard Hewson on his own solo work, most notably on the string arrangement for My Love. The day following Spector's Studio One session, he mixed the results and duplicated 51 seconds of I Me Mine to extend the song to 2 minutes 25. Those 7 sessions held across 10 days were the extent of the producer's contribution. A little more than a month later, on May the 8th, the album was finally released as Let It Be. Paul would wait another 23 years before his own stripped-down version of Let It Be became realised, with the release of the Let It Be Naked album. All of Spector's work, including the studio chatter, was obliterated. Dig It and Maggie May were removed and replaced with Don't Let Me Down. George Martin, who had produced almost all of the original sessions, finally got his name credited as producer along with the Beatles.
But then after Abbey Road was issued, Paul rang me up one day and said, "Do you know what's happened to Let It Be?" I said, "No." He said, "They've taken it to America and they've given it to Phil Spector, and he's been doing all the things that John said he wouldn't do, and they put heavenly choirs and all sorts of soupy strings on it, on my songs." He was furious. So was I. And that was how Let It Be evolved eventually. And then the final snub was that EMI said, well, we wouldn't have my name, on the album, because Phil Spector had now produced it. And I said, well, look, let's have a compromise. Why don't you say, produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector?